Repeal the 17th Amendment. That's absolutely the right step to take if you want to make a move towards real federalism, decentralization as a tool to advance liberty. But there is an absolutely massive caveat here. Since the government-run schools really never teach us any detail about what the Anti-Federalists warned about, most people have absolutely no clue that the Anti-Federalists repeatedly predicted that the structure of the Senate would lead to all kinds of corruption, abuse of power, usurpations of power, centralized control, and the like long before the 17th Amendment ever came along. And without understanding those warnings, we could still end up with the same kind of problems after repeal of the 17th Amendment. So on this episode, I've got a little bit of important background about the structure of the Senate, but primarily I'm going to be discussing three main categories of warnings from the Anti-Federalists that I think we can't ignore any longer. But first of all, before getting to that, welcome and thank you for joining me here on the Path to Liberty. My name is Michael Bolden with the 10th Amendment Center, and this is the show for Wednesday, October 30th, 2024. And let's kick it off with this article that I published a little while ago in August. When the framers designed the Senate, they envisioned it as a safeguard for the states, with a key component being state legislatures choosing senators instead of the people at large. Federalists, those were the people in support of ratification, repeatedly assured the Anti-Federalists who were opposing ratification, at least as the document stood. They assured them that because of this structure, their concerns about a total consolidation or centralization of power, which would absolutely destroy liberty, that would swallow up the states, was wrong. So they said, look, we know you're concerned about this, but look at how we set up the Senate. You don't have anything to worry about. James Madison gave an example of this in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. He said, this election of one branch of the federal by the state legislatures secures an absolute dependence of the former on the latter. Governor Johnston in North Carolina was even more forceful during their ratification debates. And he said, as long as the state legislatures have it in their power not to choose the senators, get this, they can put an end to the general government by refusing to choose senators. No one ever really thinks of that. Now, the structure was also set up this way in order to be a guard against the danger of factions under a pure democratic or pure democracy, pure democratic form of government. And John Jay put it like this in Federalist number 64. He said, the convention in Philadelphia have committed the appointment of senators to the state legislatures. This mode has, in such cases, wrote the first Chief Justice, vastly the advantage of elections by the people in their collective capacity, where the activity of party zeal, taking the advantage of the supineness, the ignorance, and the hopes and fears of the unwary and interested, often places men in office by the votes of a small proportion of the electors. Now, James Madison really took the position that this structure was basically the last line in the sand. They were creating not a pure federal system and not a pure consolidated national system, even though many of them in Philadelphia wanted a much more powerful government, more high-toned is what they would call it. But he's saying this is the last line in the sand that is the bulwark against that consolidated system. Here he is. And again, in the Virginia Ratifying Convention, he said, when we come to the Senate, its members are elected by the states in their equal and political capacity. But had the government been completely consolidated, the Senate would have been chosen by the people in their individual capacity, in the same manner as the members of the other house. So this structure was set up in order to prevent a total consolidation of the states into a singular national government. This is what at least the father of the Constitution has to say, and maybe you disagree with him, maybe you don't, but this was his argument. And he said, thus, it is of a complicated nature. And this complication, I trust, will be found to exclude the evils of absolute consolidation on one hand, as well as of a mere confederacy. Now, passage of the 17th Amendment, of course, which transferred elections for the Senate in Congress from state legislatures to the general electorate, the people at large, remove this part of the system that was seen as so crucial. I covered this in much more detail. I'm barely scratching the surface here. I covered it in much more detail in an episode back in August. 17th Amendment. Did it destroy the structure of the Constitution? And if you think about it, the way that Madison put it is like, if this is the last line in the sand that prevents the system from being totally consolidated, in other words, what the founders thought would absolutely destroy liberty, as Patrick Henry said, consolidation must end in the destruction of our liberties. Dangers are to be apprehended in whatever manner we proceed, he said, but those of a consolidation are the most destructive. Fisher Ames, on the Federalist side, said too much provision can't be made against consolidation. So they were all on board with this, preventing a total consolidation. It's just a matter of degree. So it seems logical then that if we want to advance more federalism, more decentralization as this tool to advance liberty and support the original structure of the Constitution, the goal should be to get rid of the 17th Amendment. And this is where we have to, I agree, get rid of the 17th Amendment, but we also have to be aware of the warnings of the Anti-Federalists. Because what happens if you get rid of the 17th Amendment, and they predicted things were going to be bad even before it? And then what if we continue after getting rid of repealing the 17th? What if we still have the same lifetime career senators? What if we continue to have all kinds of usurpation of power? What if we continue to have all kinds of corruption, massive amounts of corruption in the government? And then, as these things always go, what if it continues to get worse and worse and worse, despite the repeal of the 17th Amendment? And I think if you take the Anti-Federalist objections that I'm going to get to here in a moment, it probably would. And that's, well, unless the population really is more educated on the source of the problems, on these foundational warnings from the Anti-Federalist side, they will ignorantly then blame federalism as the source of their problem and then set things back even decades more in the future. So I've got their top categories of warnings on this in just a moment. But first, a little bit more history surrounding the adoption of the 17th Amendment. Here from Rob Nadelson, he points out that the amendment resulted from a decades-long public campaign and there were bills filed decades before it ever passed, decades-long campaign to persuade Congress to formally propose the amendment. Congress then did so only after around 29 or 30 state legislatures applied for an amendments convention under Article 5 in order to bypass Congress. So Congress was refusing to do this, and state legislators, oddly enough, were very willing to actually give up their own power. So there was a lot of pressure on them. It was very popular to do this. Not saying that popular is right in many situations, but just so you understand what's going on. Rob writes that once Congress finally acted, check this out, the necessary 3/4 of the state legislatures ratified it in less than 11 months. It was like a lightning round of ratification, completing the process on April 8th, 1913. And again, that does not mean that popularity is what makes things right. It generally is not. But there were real issues that were happening prior to the 17th Amendment, and most people were trying to solve them. They thought they were going to deal with things like corruption and what they called deadlocks. First of all, deadlocks. Rob puts it like this. State legislatures often couldn't agree on a Senate candidate. For example, one legislative chamber might favor one candidate while the other chamber favored another. The result was a deadlock. I mean, to me, that sounds like a great time. The less senators that are there, in some situations, maybe you'll have less violations of the Constitution, but maybe not. Maybe not. Legislatures, Rob writes, sometimes balloted for months on end while their state remained underrepresented in Congress. And I can see how people had a problem with that, because if the government keeps doing stuff and you have no say whatsoever, or you're missing a seat, then, well, you're underrepresented. A deadlock, for example, delayed the selection of New York senators in the very first Congress, and the phenomenon became more and more common as time wore on. And Rob points out that between 1891 and 1905, this is 14 years only, there were 45 deadlock senatorial elections in 20 different states. I think at one point, maybe it was 1850, somewhere in the middle part of the 19th century. In Indiana, Senate seat went vacant for around 2 years. And then later on, one in Delaware actually went vacant for like 4 years. Now, the biggest issue, even though they were concerned about deadlocks, they weren't super common, but the biggest complaint was really about corruption. And there was plenty of corruption happening before the 17th Amendment was adopted. I know there is plenty of corruption with these people today, but there was a lot of warnings about corruption before the 17th Amendment as well. And Rob puts it like this. In the later part of the 19th century, the public learned of shocking cases of wealthy and ambitious men bribing state legislatures to give them Senate seats. So the thought was direct election was then seen as a partial cure because it's far harder, and he said, although admittedly not impossible, to bribe millions of voters than to purchase a few hundred state lawmakers. So the idea was, well, the more people that they have to buy off, the harder it's going to be. Then again, maybe it's been the other way. I'm not sure, because they've been able to buy people off with welfare programs ever since. But that was the argument that was being made at the time. Rob points out that many people acknowledge that in the early republic, state legislative election had produced good quality senators. But in subsequent years, they believed the Senate had become dominated by moneyed interests, basically a millionaire's club. Direct election would bring in new blood and weaken the power of the rich and financial elite. And so really corruption was the big thing. So let's get into these three categories of warnings from the Anti-Federalists of how things would play out, no matter how they were choosing the Senate, who was electing the Senate as it was structured under the original Constitution. First of all, here, there was no recall power under the Constitution. There was a recall power under the Articles of Confederation, and many of the Anti-Federalists cited this as a problem, as a reason to vote no on ratification. Here from Article 5 of the Articles of Confederation, for the more convenient management of the general interests of the United States, delegates shall be annually appointed in such a manner as the legislature of each state shall direct, to meet in Congress on the first Monday in November in every year, with a power reserved to each state to recall its delegates, or any of them, at any time within the year, and to send others in their stead for the remainder of the year. So there was an expressly listed power, reserved power, to recall delegates sent to the Confederation Congress. And this was seen as extremely important. Patrick Henry was arguing about this in Virginia during the ratification debates. He said, "At present, you may appeal to the voice of the people and send men to Congress positively instructed to obey your direction. You can recall them if their system of policy be ruinous." So the way things are now under the Articles of Confederation, Patrick Henry's saying, well, at least we have control over what they're doing in this general government. In this new system, I'm not happy with that either. But can you in this government, this was the proposed constitution, recall your senators? Or can you instruct them? Well, no, you cannot recall them. You may instruct them and offer your opinions, but if they think them improper, they may disregard them. Patrick Henry was not alone with this view. Federal Farmer in his 10th paper, he said the new plan is a totally different thing, comparing it to the Articles of Confederation again. A national government to many purposes administered by men chosen for 2, 4, and 6 years, not recallable, and among whom there will be no rotation. George Mason, another example, he said the senators are chosen for 6 years. They are not recallable for those 6 years. This is one of his top complaints about the structure of the Constitution. And then they're still re-eligible at the end of those 6 years. He said it stands on a very different ground from the Confederation. By that system, they were only elected for 1 year, might be recalled, and were incapable of re-election. Now, I covered this myth. This is a very common myth, especially among supporters of our work, that, well, also before the 17th Amendment, states could just recall their senators whenever they want. This is a total myth. I don't know where it came from. Probably the fact that the government-run schools have been propagandizing people for generations, and we don't really have a solid foundation. But people have heard there was some kind of recall power at some point, but that was in the Articles of Confederation, never in the Constitution for the United States. There was a lot of debate over this. None of the Anti-Federalists thought this was the case, and the Federalists thought it was a good thing to not have them recallable. So that was the argument. Now, I covered that in some additional detail in another episode. 17th Amendment myth busted. There was no recall power. And while I'm here, I should mention I am referencing all kinds of original source documents. I've got another article that I mentioned already, some episodes, etc. All of these will be linked to in the show notes. We publish a blog for every single episode that we do here. Alan Mosley organizes that blog post. It includes a show link section plus all the various platforms. We live stream on the mainstream ones, of course, like YouTube and X and Facebook and LinkedIn and Twitch, etc. We also live stream over at rumble.com and odyssey.com. I love these other platforms and I appreciate the growing community on both of those. Well, wherever you want to be. We also have the audio-only podcast edition, basically everywhere we can think of putting it. So let us know if we're missing from a platform that you want to see us on. And if we happen to be missing someday from one that you are used to watching or listening on, you'll be able to find other ones over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Again, Alan Mosley will get the blog post organized for this episode, and I'll get it published over there in the next couple of hours after the live stream is done. But I want to get right back to it since we got a lot to cover here today. So the first one was the first warning, the first issue that the Anti-Federalists had was that there was no recall power. And the other two categories I'm going to discuss, they all kind of tie together and lead towards what they warned about. So the next one that we have is that they're in office too long. They wanted a rotation they had many examples. For example, maybe 6 out of every 12 years they could be there, or maybe just shorter terms, a year or 2 years, or maybe even a hard term limit. Here, for example, Colonel William Jones in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention said his objections still remained that senators chosen for so long a time will forget their duty to their constituents. We cannot, said he, recall them. The choice of representatives was too long. The Senate was much worse. The representatives, 2 years. That was too long for these guys. The Senate was much worse. It is, said he, a bad precedent and is unconstitutional. Now, you're thinking, well, but they hadn't even drafted a constitution, but it's against the system and the tradition of what they had been in support of for so long. Now, Dr. Taylor, also in the Massachusetts Ratifying Convention on that same day, he followed up by saying that without a recall power, without the power to recall, and with these long terms, he said once they are chosen forever. This was a constant argument from the Anti-Federalist Mercy Otis Warren in her great observations on the new Constitution. I think it was in April of 1788. She warned that a Senate chosen for 6 years. Now, notice she isn't talking about the mode of choosing them. She's literally just saying that the underlying problem is that they're in office for 6 years. A Senate chosen for 6 years will, in most instances, be an appointment for life. We got to pay a lot more attention to people like Mercy Otis Warren, the muse of the American Revolution, because on this one, for example, she pretty much nailed it. Here's Melancton Smith in the New York Ratifying Convention with a similar argument. He said, as the clause now stands, there is no doubt that the senators will hold their office perpetually. Now, he didn't get this 100% right, but if you were to grade this, in many situations, senators stay in office, and I would say in a large majority. Maybe someone knows the numbers better than I do, but it sure feels like as long as a senator wants to stay in office, they stay there until they decide to step down. And that really is not different than being in office for life or perpetually. Anyway, Smith continued with this. And in this situation, they must of necessity lose their dependence and attachment to the people. So the longer they're in office, the longer that they're around the halls of power, the more likely they're going to have less interest and attachment to the people, the state that they're supposed to represent, and just start doing stuff that the halls of power want them to do. Now, Mercy Otis Warren discussed this same kind of thing with John Adams. John Adams was seen as the Atlas of Independence, a great supporter of the rights of the people before independence. But then he spent too much time near the monarchs. He spent too much time, for example, in Great Britain. And when he came back and eventually was the second president, she said he had kind of a tinge of monarchy with him because he spent too much time in the halls of power. And this was a consistent argument from the Anti-Federalists regarding the Senate. So in this situation, they must of necessity lose their dependence and attachment to the people. It is certainly inconsistent with the established principles of republicanism. Again, that's how, I forget who it was who said it was unconstitutional, this system. Maybe it was Colonel William Jones, I believe, in Massachusetts. Let me see. Yeah, this was the established rules that they were used to, what they expected, what they understood. It is inconsistent with the established principles of republicanism that the Senate should be a fixed and unchangeable body of men. And even if it's 90% fixed, that's also really, really bad. So the next category is that there's a too much mixture or blending of powers. This was a very widely accepted view, primarily coming from Montesquieu, the celebrated Montesquieu, who I think was cited during the ratification debates, Philadelphia Convention, more than anybody else, in his Spirit of the Laws, where he discussed how if you blend the legislative and the executive, the judiciary and the legislative executive, any of these branches, when they're blended, you can't have any liberty. Now, the argument, both of the sides cited Montesquieu over and over. Some of them said, well, you can kind of blend. Another one said, well, you can't blend at all. We know which sides are each on those. But anyways, here from the Center for the Study of the American Constitution, great website. They have a nice article here on the debate over the Senate. And they point out that additional concerns focused on the Senate's blended functions with the executive branch in appointments and making treaties. We don't often think of this. They also complained that the executive branch was partly legislative because they had a veto power. If the executive had no legislative function, then the legislature would pass laws and the executive would execute them. But there is some blending, and the Anti-Federalists were not cool with that in many situations. For Anti-Federalists, this was a lack of a separation of powers between the branches of government. Additional concerns centered on the placement of the vice president as the president of the Senate, also putting the executive and the legislative branch with voting powers in the event of a deadlock. Anti-Federalists were also critical of the Senate's role in trying cases of impeachment, and this was putting the Senate partly judicial. Because of the Senate's power to confirm appointments, they said, Anti-Federalists speculated that the Senate would not convict anyone who was impeached. I think it was Patrick Henry who said that the impeachment power was basically going to be a sham. Now, there have been some people impeached and, well, removed by the Senate, but it's not super common. And if you think about the fact that we live under the largest government in history, that is nowhere close to the original Constitution of few and defined powers, as James Madison described it in Federalist 45, everybody should be getting impeached all the time, but it just doesn't happen. So maybe Patrick Henry was correct, and maybe the Anti-Federalist speculation that's this blending of power would play out was maybe absolutely correct. Here's Cincinnatus in response to James Wilson, one of the leading high-tone nationalists on the Federalist side. Cincinnatus, number 4. The whole truth, then, is that the same body called the Senate is vested with legislative, executive, and judicial powers. So the Senate has a little bit of all of them. The first two, he said, you acknowledge, and James Wilson did. But James Wilson said, well, that's okay. But Cincinnatus said the last is conveyed in these words, section 3. The Senate shall have the sole power to try all impeachments. On this point, then, we are to come to issue whether a Senate so constituted is likely to produce a baneful aristocracy which will swallow up the democratic rights and liberties of the nation. A similar argument was made by the dissent of the minority of the Pennsylvania Convention. There was some cancel culture going on in Pennsylvania in the early part of the ratification debates, but they did publish this series of objections to the Constitution. And they put it like this. The next consideration that the Constitution presents is the undue and dangerous mixture of the powers of government, the same body possessing legislative, executive, and judicial powers. The Senate is a constituent branch of the legislature. It has judicial power in judging on impeachments. And in this case, it unites in some measures the characters of judge and party, as all the principal officers are appointed by the President General with the concurrence of the Senate, and therefore they derive their offices in part from the Senate. And one more here from Sentinel In his second Anti-Federalist essay, this is October of 1787, he said, "This mixture of the legislative and executive, moreover, highly tends to corruption." And corruption was what they repeatedly warned we'd get from these various issues. Whether it was one, a mixture, or a combination of a mixture of powers plus too long of a term, plus no recall power. There's no reason. If you can't be recalled, do whatever you want. And then as long as the person that you're running against, if you can paint them as being worse than you, then people are going to support you. And this is exactly how things play out today. Corruption was the number one result that we would get. And supposedly, the 17th Amendment was going to remove the corruption that was happening under the structure that we were warned we were going to get corruption with. Anyways, here's how George Mason put it in the Virginia Ratifying Convention. He said, in the new Constitution, instead of being elected for 1, they are chosen for 6 years, discussing the Senate, of course. They cannot be recalled in all that time for any misconduct, and at the end of that long term, may again be elected. To him, this was a nightmare scenario. He said, what will be the operation of this? Is it not probable that those gentlemen who will be elected senators will fix themselves in the federal town and become citizens of that town more than that of our state? He said they will purchase a good seat in or near the town and become inhabitants of that place. Will it not be then in the power of the Senate to worry the House of Representatives into anything? So he's saying that the Senate was really going to turn things into a monarchy or a permanent baneful aristocracy, really nasty stuff. He said they will be a continually existing body. They will exercise those machinations and contrivances which the many have always to fear from the few. That's George Mason. Of course, that'll be linked to in the show notes so you can read it in context on your own time. Here again is Mercy Otis Warren from her great Anti-Federalist paper. She said, there is no provision for a rotation, nor anything to prevent the perpetuity of office in the same hands for life, which, by a little well-timed bribery, will probably be done, to the exclusion of men of the best abilities from their share in the offices of government. So a little bit of bribery. They can pay off the senators. She's warning us they pay off the state legislatures. It'd be easy to stay in there forever. This is what Mercy Otis Warren said was going to happen. And that's what a lot of people complained about was happening. And whether, when you look at the history behind it, whether you agree that's what was happening, this is what people believed was happening. But it seems like no one knew that was what was predicted to happen in the first place. So not understanding the source of the problem means the solution was totally in the wrong direction as well. Anyways, Mercy continued with this. By this neglect, we lose the advantages of that check to the overbearing insolence of office, by which rendering him ineligible at certain periods keeps the mind of man in equilibrio and teaches him the feelings of the governed and better qualifies him to govern in his turn. I think Luther Martin, this is kind of a long piece here, but I think he summed up how all this tied together into corruption, maybe the best. This is in Genuine Information, his 4th essay in this series in January of 1788. First, he's talking about, well, here's how we structured things in our own state. He said, Mr. Speaker, in this state, it is provided by its constitution that the representatives in Congress shall be chosen annually, shall be paid by the state, and shall be subject to recall even within the year. So cautiously has our Constitution guarded against an abuse of the trust reposed in our representatives. However, in this new federal government, he says, whereas by the 3rd and 6th sections of the 1st article of this new system, the senators are to be chosen for 6 years instead of being chosen annually. Instead of their being paid by their states who send them, they, in conjunction with the other branch, are to pay themselves out of the Treasury of the United States and are not liable to be recalled during the period for which they are chosen. What will be the result? Shouldn't be a surprise. He said, thus, sir, for 6 years, the senators are rendered totally and absolutely independent of their states, of whom they ought to be the representatives, without any bond or tie between them. During that time, writes Martin, they may join in measures ruinous and destructive to their states, even such as should totally annihilate their state governments, and their states cannot recall them nor exercise any control over them. And as I've been saying all along, we are never taught about these warnings in the government-run schools. So when people are thinking about how do we deal with this corruption that we're seeing, they never think that there maybe is an alternative that someone else thought was going to happen. And in many ways, I can say in this situation, the Anti-Federalists absolutely called it. And if you want to help us reach and teach more and more people with this essential foundational information, we work hard every single day to get the job done, but nothing helps us do this work more than the financial faith and support of our members. If you got a couple of bucks of that dirty government fiat, please consider throwing it our way over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. That's all spelled out, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. We also have annual, 5-year, and lifetime options. Otherwise, our monthly membership program starts at $2 a month. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. I'd be extremely grateful for any consideration you can give to throwing some financial support our way today. If you're not able to do that, no sweat. There's a number of easy peasy ways you can help us spread the word. Primarily hitting that like button, leaving reviews on Apple Podcasts or any other podcast platform, leaving comments in the archive, subscribing, getting notifications, all the stuff, the ways that you can interact, sharing links with, especially with the mainstream platforms. The more that you do this kind of stuff, the more that it'll tell the algorithms, hey, you should show this to more and more people like you. And we've been reaching way more people than I ever expected possible. We're still scratching the surface, so I'm very grateful for any support you can give us today, whether through our membership program, other ways, or a combination of all the above. Again, I really appreciate you spending some of your time with me today. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I hope it made you think. I hope you learned something that's more important than anything. And I look forward to seeing you next time here on the Path to Liberty.